Hello and welcome to Yesterday's Airlines. In today's video we're going to investigate another one of my 400 scale airline fleets, and that is going to be Republic Airlines and the airlines that made up Republic until it was absorbed by Northwest. And as with all my local service airlines, they are stored over in the US part of the collection in the third of these cabinets next to the US trunk airlines. And the airlines that made up Republic are stored on the second and third shelves. So firstly we've got the airlines which eventually formed Hughes Airwest, Bonanza, West Coast and Pacific. And then those were swallowed into Republic after Republic had been formed from the merger of Southern Airways and North Central. So it is those 5 local service airlines that we will investigate today, all of which would form part of the Republic Airlines, which itself was eventually absorbed in 1986 into Northwest. So as with all of these fleet videos, I will now open up the cabinets and take a closer look at the models within. So I'll begin with the carriers which made up the famous tri-merger that formed Airwest. And as with most local service airlines, there's not a great deal of representation of their early years in the 1950s, but there is a little bit of representation, at least for these smaller airlines, in the 60s. So start down here in the left, and first up is Bonanza Airlines, which was one of the more pioneering of the local service airlines. As with all the others, it operated Douglas DC-3s and C-47s, and unusually we actually do have an example here. But Bonanza also was a pioneer of jet props and was one of the earliest local service airlines to acquire the new American-built version of the Fokker F-27, the Fairchild F-27. As you can see, West Coast and Pacific were also F-27 operators, and the earliest aircraft we have for those are F-27s. In fact, for West Coast, it is the only aircraft in 400 scale. Pacific Airlines, which operated on the American West Coast, as the name kind of suggests, did expand into jets and actually acquired a trio, I think, of Boeing 727-100s. And this is an Aero Classics example, which was made quite recently. West Coast and Bonanza, they stuck with DC-9s, but there haven't been any made in 400 scale, or at least not in recent years, and we're sorely lacking a good short DC-9 mould in this scale. It was, however, those 3 airlines which would combine in 1968 to form the new Airwest. And Airwest acquired a very modern looking livery, as you can see here, where we've got different colour versions of the scheme on the tail, really attractive. And by this point, all the airlines had begun to operate larger DC-930s. However, you can also see here that the Pacific 727s also acquired this new colour scheme too. They didn't last too long, the 727-100s, and in fact, Airwest itself didn't last particularly long, as it was swallowed up. Well, not really swallowed up, it was taken over, I guess, by Howard Hughes, partly because the merger itself had been a bit of a disaster. And that led to the creation of the Flying Banana, which was Top Banana in the West, as you can see, Hughes Airwest, only 2 years later in 1970. They famously painted the aircraft bright yellow. They had these reflective windows, and I think the scheme was called Sundance, but obviously it was marketed as the Top Banana, and they were very, very bright. And here you can see the F-27s got across into that scheme, as did of course the DC-9s. And later in its years, Hughes Airwest also began to acquire longer 727-200s. Now Howard Hughes by this point was really not in control of the airline, especially in its later years. And it was an airline that by the late 70s was rather unloved. And unsurprisingly, as deregulation hit and mergers became standard, it was eyed up by the New Republic, and Hughes Airwest was merged into Republic itself in 1980. Now, who is Republic Airlines? Well, they really were North Central Airlines, one of the larger and more successful local service airlines in a new garb for deregulation. And we'll have a look now at the other part of the fleet to see the beginnings of North Central and Southern Airways, which combined to form Republic. North Central Airlines and Southern Airways were another pair of local service airlines, of which North Central was far and away the most aggressive in terms of its expansion. You can see that early on, or at least the earliest 400 scale model I have is this Convair, where they have Herman the duck on the tail, as they always did, but they have a rather red version of the scheme going. That was replaced by a few varieties of an aqua and dark blue scheme, and you can see behind this Convair is a turboprop, a jet prop Convair 580. They were big operators of the 580. Southern Airways, by contrast, never operated Convairs, and they based their post DC3 fleet on the Martin 404. And there isn't a Martin in 400 scale, unfortunately. So the earliest Southern Airways aircraft we have is this DC-930. Southern Airways, a very classic Southern US airline, route of the aristocrats, I believe their slogan was, and had this rather nice S scheme. Into the 70s, they updated their scheme, as most airlines did, and the aristocratic S was replaced by the spaghetti stripes and this blue cheat line, which got onto their Martins, and also they operated Metroliners too. And they're the only two aircraft we've got for Southern in 400 scale. So again, we're missing a short DC-9 mould and missing many of the early piston aircraft that they operated. Skipping over to the other side of the cabinet, and you can see that North Central was a major DC-9 operator, much like Southern. And here is at the start a DC-930 wearing their 1970 scheme, and behind that a pair of DC-950s, which they were a reasonably strong customer for. As deregulation loomed, North Central began to think about growth, and Southern Airways route network complemented its own rather beautifully. Southern obviously focused on the south, Georgia and Alabama and places like that, and North Central, as its name suggests, focused very much around Minneapolis. So they complement each other beautifully, and the merger was one of the more successful, creating the New Republic Airlines. And before the merger, North Central practiced out some livery variations, as you can see with this pair of DC-9s, and when the Republic scheme was created, you can see that the eventual scheme, the one in the forefront there, was very similar to the test scheme behind it. And that scheme was applied to the Convair 580s and of course to other DC-9s in the fleet. However, some aircraft, quite a few aircraft, just gained these kind of hybrid markings. And obviously, for a time, the Southern fleet also was operating mainly in hybrid schemes. Not content with absorbing Southern, the New Republic also acquired Hughes Airwest in 1980. And for a time, more hybrids were appearing, like this DC-9. Republic quickly grew to become, in fact, the airline with the most separate destinations. That's not necessarily an accolade it wanted, and the carrier struggled financially in its early years in the 80s in the deregulated era. It did, nonetheless, turn a corner and change its image, not to everyone's liking. Herman, who'd been resplendent on the tail of Republic aircraft and North Central aircraft pretty much since the 1950s, was largely removed, and in fact I think only appeared on the passenger door. And instead we gained this scheme, which has been named the Mary Tyler Moore scheme, mainly I think because of the font of the Republic lettering. Anyway, it's a fairly business-like scheme and was applied to the DC-9s and the 727s and also new Boeing 757s. But merger mania was rife at this period in the 1980s, and Republic, despite some weakness, or maybe because of it, was an asset that was hard to pass up. So even though Northwest's acquisition of Republic in 1986 meant that it gained dominance in places like Minneapolis and Detroit, the merger was okayed. And that led to a whole variety of these hybrid schemes. And that really is the history of Republic. It was a bit of a mess. It wasn't especially successful, but it was successful enough and large enough that it was enviable for Northwest, and they wanted it. But previous to that, North Central had successfully grown and taken over both Southern and slightly less successfully Hughes Airwest. And so when Northwest acquired Republic Airlines, it was actually acquiring 5 of the previous local service airlines. Okay guys, well I hope you enjoyed this quick look around my Republic Airlines fleet. As always, check out my other channels, yesterdaysairlines.com and at Yester Airlines on Instagram and Facebook for more of these videos exploring my collection and other information about 400 scale models. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time.